The apartment complex was a place of comfortable routines. People knew each other's schedules. The man in 4B walked his little dog every morning at 7. The family in 2A always had the smell of garlic and tomatoes cooking on Sunday afternoons. And the quiet man in the ground floor corner apartment, the one with the ivy plant in the window, left every Tuesday and Thursday with a worn, brown leather case. His name was Elias, to his neighbors. He was a kind, but somewhat distant figure. He was the man who would hold the door open for someone carrying groceries, offering a small, closed-mouth smile, but never starting a conversation. He was the one who collected everyone's mail if they were on vacation, stacking it neatly on their kitchen table. His job was known in that vague way neighborhood facts are known. He worked with pianos. Most believed he fixed them, like a handyman for instruments. The older kids thought he might be a piano teacher, but a very quiet one. The truth was, he was a tuner. He had a small workshop in a room at the back of the local music school, and his days were spent in the company of pianos that were out of tune. He would arrive at a silent, waiting instrument, open his case of special tools, and begin his work. It was a job of incredible patience and a very, very good ear. He would strike a single key, listen to the vibration of the string, make a tiny adjustment with a tuning hammer, and listen again. For hours the only sounds would be the single, ringing notes and the soft tapping of his tools. This life suited him. There was a peace in the work, a satisfaction in bringing order and harmony to something that had fallen into chaos. He loved the feel of the instruments, the smooth ivory of old keys, the heavy, solid feel of a grand piano's frame. He spoke more to pianos in a day than he did to people in a week, and he was perfectly content with that dot in his own apartment. He had an old upright piano pushed against the living room wall. It was not a beautiful instrument. Its wood was scratched, and one of its legs was slightly repaired with a metal bracket. But to him, it was perfect. He had tuned it himself to a standard, so precise it could make a professional musician weep. This is where the faint sounds his neighbors sometimes heard came from Mrs. Gable, who lived directly above him, would pause while watering her plants. She had been a music teacher long ago. She would hear the careful, slow climbing of scales, each note clear and even as a drop of water. She'd hear fragments of melodies, repeated, turned around, played in different rhythms. To her, it sounded like someone practicing exercises, maybe a very dedicated adult student. She never heard a full song, just these pieces. She assumed he was a learner, perhaps trying to play simple tunes. The thought was sweet to her. A man his age, finding joy in learning something new. The younger boy who lived next door, who liked to sit on the fire escape and read comic books, had a different take. He would hear bursts of music that sounded like the background of an old cartoon, fast, playful, and complicated. But it would stop as suddenly as it started, replaced again by those slow scales. The boy figured the man was just testing the piano. Like a mechanic revving an engine dot, no one connected the dots. They didn't see the deep connection between his job and the sounds from his apartment. To them, a piano tuner was a technician, a specialist with tools, not an artist. They pictured him with a screwdriver, not with his hands flying across the keys. His quiet nature reinforced this. Artists were expressive, weren't they? They were dramatic. Elias was the opposite of dramatic. He was the man who always looked at his shoes when he talked to you. The real Elias, alone with his piano, was somewhere in between. The scales and exercises were his way of keeping his fingers supple, of listening to the purity of the tuning. But the bursts of music, the cartoonish ragtime, the deep blues chords, the sudden flash of a classical phrase, that was his soul speaking. It was a private conversation, a release of a lifetime of music he had absorbed, filtered through his own mind. He played for the joy of the sound, for the puzzle of it, with no thought of an audience. He knew the people in the building had a certain idea of him. He was the piano guy. It was easier that way. If they thought he was just a repairman, there were no expectations. No one would ask him to play at a party or for a school event. He could keep his world separate, the public world of careful, quiet work, and the private world of limitless, personal sound God. So life in the apartment complex went on with its gentle rhythm. Elias was part of the background, a familiar and respected piece of the scenery. His mystery was not the exciting kind. It was simply a lack of information. He was a closed book, and the neighborhood, busy with its own stories, never thought to try and open it. They were content with the title on the cover, Elias, the Piano Tuner. They had no idea that the pages inside were filled with a symphony. The community room in the apartment building was a well-meaning but slightly sad space. It had a faded blue carpet, fluorescent lights that buzzed, and a lingering smell of old coffee and cleaning spray. In the corner, like a sleeping beast, sat the piano. It was a grand piano, or at least it had been one, many years ago. Now it was a dusty monument to good intentions. Everyone knew the piano was there, and everyone knew it was broken. Its once shiny black finish was cloudy with scratches. The lid was permanently closed, and a small handwritten sign that said, "Please do not touch," was yellowing with age. The children sometimes dared each other to press a key during holiday parties, resulting in a dull, muffled thunk that was more of a vibration than a note. The piano had a history. Of course, Mrs. Gable, who lived upstairs from Elias, remembered when it was first donated. A wealthy family from a bigger house down the street was moving and couldn't take it. There was a small ceremony, a ribbon cutting, and for a few years it was used. There were Christmas carols and shaky recitals by little kids taking lessons. But pianos, like people, need care. They need to be tuned. The insides need checking. The keys need adjusting. The building's management budget never seemed to stretch to piano maintenance. So year by year, it fell silent. It became a piece of furniture, a place to put paper plates during the summer barbecue, or to stack folded chairs after a meeting. It was a shared, quiet disappointment. People felt a little guilty looking at it. It represented something they wanted their community to have: culture, music, shared joy, but which reality had allowed to gather dust. The decision to fix it started with the children. During the annual meeting of the Residents Association, where adults talked about gutter cleaning and parking permits, a small boy raised his hand. He was the one who liked to read on the fire escape. He asked, simply, "Why can't we play the piano anymore?" His mother tried to shush him, but the question hung in the air. Mrs. Gable felt a pang. The retired choir director in her couldn't let it lie. "It's terribly out of tune," she said softly. It would cost a fair bit to get a professional tuner in. That's when the man from 3C, who worked in accounting, had an idea. What about our guy? The quiet fellow on the ground floor? Elias. Doesn't he work on pianos for a living? Maybe he could give us a rate. A murmur of agreement went around the room. It was a perfect solution. They knew Elias. He was reliable. He was one of them. He wouldn't charge some outrageous city price. The chairman of the association, a friendly retired bus driver, was put in charge of asking him. The next day, the chairman found Elias collecting his mail. He made small talk about the weather and brought up the piano. "We were hoping, maybe you could take a look at the old thing in the community room. See if it's even worth saving. We've got a small fund for building improvements. We could pay you for your time, of course." Elias listened, his eyes on his mailbox key. He didn't like the spotlight, even one this small. His first instinct was to find a polite way to say no. He worked on pianos all day. The last thing he wanted was to do it in his free time in front of his neighbors. But then he thought of the piano itself. He had seen it, of course, He knew it was a Steinway from a good era, a piano that had been born to make beautiful sound. To him, a neglected instrument was a sad thing, like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. He looked up and gave a small nod. "I can look at it," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I can't promise anything until I see the inside." The news spread quickly through the building. "Elias is going to fix the piano." It became a small spark of excitement. People who had never spoken more than 2 words to him now gave him hopeful smiles in the hallway. The boy from the fire escape was especially thrilled. He imagined proper music finally filling that dull room. Saturday morning arrived. Elias came with his familiar brown leather case. He wore his usual plain clothes, not looking like a performer, but like a man going to do a job. To his surprise, when he pushed open the door to the community room, there were people there. It wasn't a crowd, but it wasn't empty. Mrs. Gable had come down with her knitting. The chairman was there, fiddling with the coffee machine. A couple of parents with young, curious children had found excuses to be there. The boy from next door was sitting on a windowsill, trying to look casual. Elias felt a flutter of nervousness. He was used to working alone, or with a musician who understood the process. This was different. These people were waiting for a show, and he was just here to adjust strings and tighten screws. He set his case down, lifted the heavy lid of the piano, and propped it open. A faint smell of old wood and dust drifted out. The inside was a landscape of golden wires, hammers, and felt. To the others, it looked complex and mysterious. To Elias, it was a familiar map. He took out his tools, his tuning hammer, his mutes, his strip of felt. He gave the keys a gentle press. The sound was awful. Notes stuck together. Tones were flat and sour, a chorus of dissonance. He got to work. For the next 45 minutes, the room was filled with the strange, repetitive sounds of tuning. He would hit a single note, over and over a harsh, ringing A, while he adjusted its string. Then he would move to another, creating intervals that sounded wrong before they suddenly snapped into a perfect, clear harmony. It was not musical. It was technical, almost clinical. The young children, who had expected songs, grew bored and started to whisper. One of the parents took them out for ice cream. Elias was in his zone now, forgetting the audience. His ear was everything. He was listening for the pure wave of the note, for the slow beat of dissonance to smooth into a single, true tone. He fixed a sticky key, tightened a loose hammer. He was saving the instrument, note by note. Finally, he closed the lid and ran a soft cloth over the now gleaming wood. He had done his job. The piano was alive again. He started to pack his tools. The small audience, feeling the show was over, began to stretch. Mrs. Gable looked at the beautiful, silent piano and felt a deep, wistful ache. It was like seeing a vintage car, restored but never driven. She sighed, a soft sound in the quiet room. "What a shame," she said, not really to anyone, but to the universe. "All that work, and this old thing hasn't had a real piece of music played on it in 10 years. To hear it sing again, that would be something." Elias, zipping up his tool case, stopped. He looked from her sad, smiling face to the piano. He looked at the boy on the windowsill, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. He saw the instrument not as a job anymore, but as a living thing he had just healed. And for the first time in this place, in front of these people, a different feeling rose in him. Not the nervousness of being watched, but a simple, powerful desire to hear what it could do. Without a word, he turned. He sat back down on the bench, the one he had just vacated. He opened the lid once more. He flexed his fingers once, lightly. The room, which had been relaxed, suddenly went perfectly still. He placed his hands on the keys, took a slow, deep breath, and began. For a second, there was only the soft rustle of his sleeves against the wood of the piano bench. The air in the community room, which had been loose and easy just moments before, suddenly felt thick and expectant. Everyone held their breath without knowing why. It was the way he had sat down. It wasn't the careful posture of a man about to test a repair. It was the settled, sure stance of someone coming home. His fingers, which had just been carefully tightening screws, now hovered above the keys. They were ordinary hands, with a few scars and nicks from years of work. Then they descended, and the first chord rang out. It was simple. It was the opening of a very old, very familiar song. A gentle, walking melody. A few of the older residents recognized it. It was a song from a different time, sweet and a little sad. The man from 3C, the accountant, felt a memory stir. His mother used to hum this while she cooked. Mrs. Gable smiled softly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. This was nice. This was what they had hoped for. A pretty tune on their fixed piano. But then something shifted. Elias's left hand, which had been playing a basic rhythm, began to wander. The simple chords deepened, grew richer. They started to move in directions that felt both surprising and perfectly right. It was like watching a single thread of smoke suddenly twist into a beautiful, complex pattern. The right-hand melody, the one everyone knew, was still there, but now it was dressed in new clothes. Little sparkling notes danced around it, playful and light. A trill here, a sudden run down the keys there, so fast it was a blur of sound. The boy on the windowsill sat up straight, his comic book slipping from his fingers to the floor. His mouth was slightly open. This wasn't just playing. This was alchemy. Elias's body, usually so still and contained, began to move with the music. A slight sway of his shoulders. A dip of his head when he reached for a deep, resonant bass note. His eyes were not on his hands. They were closed or looking at some distant point on the wall. He was not in the community room anymore. He was inside the music. The familiar song melted away, transforming into something completely new. It became a conversation between his two hands. The left hand started a low walking bass line that sounded like something from a jazz club, cool and late night. Over the top, the right hand began to improvise, spinning a melody that was happy and lonely all at once. It was playful, skipping over the keys, then it would slow, becoming thoughtful, asking a musical question. Mrs. Gable's hand had gone to her chest. Her professional ear, long dormant, was wide awake. What she was hearing was not just skill, it was vocabulary. This was the language of someone who had listened to a century of music ragtime, blues, classical, jazz, and had absorbed it all into his bones. Those fragments she'd heard through her floor, those bursts of cartoon music the boy described, they weren't separate things. They were the pieces of this. He was putting them all together now, in real time, building a castle in the air. He moved into a section that was pure, joyful rhythm. His fingers became hammers on the keys, not pounding, but bouncing, creating a sound that made you want to move. It was infectious and bright. The retired bus driver, the chairman, found his foot tapping, a big grin spreading across his face without his permission. Then, as suddenly as the joy had come, it deepened. The music softened, slowed. The notes became clear and heartbreakingly pure, one after another, like drops of water. It sounded like a memory or a loss. It was a piece of classical music, maybe, but filtered through his own soul. The woman who had come down just for coffee felt her eyes prickle with unexpected tears. She wasn't sure why. It just felt like something. Throughout it all, the piano itself was a different instrument. It was no longer the dusty, thumping thing in the corner. Under his hands, it sounded golden and grand. The notes had a warmth to them, a a resonance that filled the room and vibrated in the floorboards. He had not just tuned it, he had awakened its spirit. Every sound, from the lowest boom to the highest sparkling chime, was perfectly clear. The small audience was absolutely motionless. No one coughed. No one whispered. The boy was leaning so far forward, he was almost falling off the sill. They were witnessing a secret. The quiet, polite man they passed in the hall was gone. In his place was this channel, this vessel for something huge and beautiful that had been hidden inside him all along. It wasn't just that he could play the notes fast. It was the feeling he put into them. The music swelled, filled every corner of the dull room, and made the faded blue carpet and the buzzing lights disappear. They weren't in a community room anymore. They were wherever the music took them, to a rainy city street, to a quiet memory, to a place of pure, wordless joy. He was telling them a story without a single word. The story of a lifetime of listening, of practicing in solitude, of a love so private and deep that no one had even thought to look for it. And he was telling it on their piano, the one they had ignored. He had given it a voice, and now he was using that voice to speak his truth. The final section began to build. The left hand set up a powerful repeating pattern, a foundation of sound. The right hand soared above it, the melody becoming more and more passionate, more insistent. It was a climb, a beautiful struggle upwards. Faster and louder, filling the room to bursting, until it reached a peak, a magnificent, crashing chord that held for a long, vibrating moment, and then silence, a deep, ringing, perfect silence. His hands lifted from the keys and came to rest gently in his lap. The last note hung in the air, slowly fading away into nothing. He was just Elias again, sitting on the bench, his head bowed slightly. The transformation was over. The magic had been spun, and now it was done. He slowly looked up, and for the first time seemed to remember where he was. He saw their faces, the shock, the awe, the tears not yet wiped away. He looked for a moment like a man who had been caught naked. A flash of something vulnerable, almost fear, crossed his face. He had not meant to show them this. He had simply answered the call of the music, and the music had taken all of him. The room was still utterly quiet. The spell was too strong to break. No one knew what to do. What do you say after you have discovered a universe hiding in your neighbor's hands? The silence was not empty. It was full. It was thick with the echo of the music that had just finished, and heavy with a feeling none of the people in the room could name. They had come to see a piano get fixed. Instead, they had witnessed a quiet man step out of his own shadow, and the shadow had been hiding a sun. For a long moment, no one moved. The boy on the windowsill was frozen, his eyes as wide as saucers, fixed on Elias's back. The retired bus driver had stopped tapping his foot. His hand was still suspended in the air. Mrs. Gable had a single tear tracing a slow path down her wrinkled cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. Elias sat perfectly still on the bench, his shoulders slightly slumped. The energy that had flowed through him was gone, leaving him looking smaller. He stared at the piano keys, as if surprised by what they had just done. The part of him that valued privacy was now screaming in alarm. He had not played for an audience since he was a very young man, in a different life. He had forgotten what it felt like to have other people in the room when the music stopped the unbearable weight of their waiting. He slowly turned on the bench. When he saw their faces, he flinched just a little. It wasn't the polite, slightly bored looks he'd seen when he was tuning. This was something else. This was awe. This was shock. It was too much. He looked down at his hands, those traitorous hands, now lying useless in his lap. The sound that broke the silence was not applause. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath from the woman who had come for coffee. It was followed by the soft thud of Mrs. Gable's knitting bag slipping from her knees to the floor. The ordinary sound seemed to jumpstart the room. The retired bus driver was the first to find his voice. It came out rough, choked with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Well," he said, the word booming in the quiet. "Well, I'll be." He couldn't find any other words. He just started to clap. It was slow at first, heavy and deliberate. Clap, clap, clap. It was like a signal. The accountant from 3C joined in, his neat, precise clapping quickly becoming faster and louder. Then Mrs. Gable, bringing her hands together with a sound that was more about feeling than noise. The boy scrambled off the windowsill and clapped so hard his palms stung. It wasn't the polite applause after a child's recital. It was a release. It was a roar of sound they built together to fill the space where the music had been, because words had completely failed them. Elias looked up, his face flushed with a deep, uncomfortable pink. He gave a small, shaky nod, the kind that meant thank you and please stop all at once. He stood up, a bit unsteadily, and took a half step away from the piano, as if to distance himself from what had just happened. People started to move then, to speak all at once. The questions came like a waterfall. That was unbelievable," said the accountant, shaking his head as if to clear it. "How long? How long have you been able to play like that?" asked the coffee woman, her voice full of wonder. The boy just blurted out, "That was the coolest thing I've ever heard." Elias opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a man who used few words on a normal day. Now, under this storm of amazement, he was utterly wordless. He just shook his head slightly, a faint, embarrassed smile touching his lips. It was Mrs. Gable who saved him. She stood up, using the arm of her chair for support. She didn't join the barrage of questions. She walked over to him, slowly, her eyes bright. She stopped in front of him and did something that surprised everyone, including Elias. She reached out and took both of his hands in hers. They were the hands of a worker, strong but gentle. She held them, looking at them, then up at his face. "All those sounds," she said, her voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Through my ceiling. The scales. The little bits of songs. I thought you were learning." She gave his hands a small squeeze. "You weren't learning at all, were you? You were remembering. You were conversing." Her words changed the room again. They framed what had happened not as a shocking trick, but as a lifelong conversation they had only just overheard. The others quieted, listening. Elias met her eyes, and for the first time, the fear and embarrassment in his own seemed to ease just a little. He gave the smallest of nods. I just play," he said, his voice a dry whisper. He cleared his throat. "It's just for me. But why?" The boy burst out, unable to contain himself. "Why wouldn't you tell anyone? You could be famous." Elias looked at the boy, and his expression became thoughtful, almost sad. "The tuning. It's my job. It's quiet. It's enough." He struggled to explain the peace of his solitude, the pressure that the idea of performing for others had always put on him. "This," he gestured weakly back to the piano, "this is different. It's private." The retired bus driver boomed out a laugh, a warm, generous sound. "Well, it ain't private no more, son. That's for sure." He walked over and clapped a heavy, friendly hand on Elias's shoulder. "You've been holding out on us. That's our piano you brought to life. And now we've heard what it can really do." The mood in the room shifted from shock to a kind of joyful, collective ownership. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were discoverers. They were the ones who had been there the moment everyone found out. They had a shared secret that was too big to keep. The chairman's mind, used to planning routes and schedules, was already turning. "That piano," he said, his eyes lighting up, "it's just sitting here. We should have a concert. A proper one. For the whole building. A welcome summer thing. You could play. For real." A new kind of panic flashed in Elias's eyes. A whole concert. The thought made his stomach clench. But before he could refuse, Mrs. Gable spoke again, still holding his hands. "Don't answer now," she said gently, with the wisdom of a teacher who knew not to frighten a shy student. "Just think about it. The music shouldn't just go back into the walls. It's too beautiful for that." The others nodded, murmuring agreement. They began to talk excitedly among themselves, already imagining the event, the flyers, the feeling of pride. They looked at Elias not with distant politeness anymore, but with a new, deep warmth. He was no longer just the quiet tuner. He was a treasure they had somehow, miraculously, found in their own home. Elias stood in the middle of it all, feeling the strange new weight of their regard. He slowly pulled his hands from Mrs. Gable's and gave her another nod, this one full of a quiet gratitude. He picked up his brown leather tool case, a familiar, worn object that suddenly felt like a relic from his old life. He needed to escape, to breathe, to process the earthquake that had just shaken his quiet world. He made his way to the door, people patting his back and smiling as he passed. He didn't speak, just offered those small, closed-mouth smiles. As he stepped out into the hallway, the buzz of their excited voices still floating behind him, he felt the cool, quiet air of the corridor. He leaned against the wall for a second, closing his eyes. He could still feel the vibration of the piano keys in his fingertips. He could still see their stunned faces. Everything had changed. The silence of his apartment would feel different now. The scales he played would have a new meaning. He was seen, truly seen, for the first time in decades. It was terrifying. And yet, buried deep beneath the fear, like a single clear note, was a feeling he barely recognized. It was the faint, fragile echo of belonging. The quiet in Elias's apartment was different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet he was used to. It was a quiet that hummed. It felt like the air was still vibrating from the shockwave that had just moved through his life. For 2 days, he barely left. He moved from his chair to the kitchen window and back again, his old upright piano sitting silently in the corner like a witness. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. Playing had always been his private language. Now, everyone had heard it. The building, however, was buzzing. News travels fast in a place where people share walls and laundry rooms. The story grew with each telling. By the time it reached the people on the top floor, it was a full-blown legend. The piano tuner in 1B is actually a secret concert pianist. He played for 20 minutes straight and made old Mrs. Gable cry. He fixed the broken piano with his bare hands and then made it sound like $1 million. People looked at him differently. It wasn't just the ones who had been in the room. Now, when he went to check his mail, neighbors would stop and smile, not the old polite nod, but a real knowing smile. The young couple from the second floor asked him shyly if he could recommend a good piano for their daughter to start lessons on. The man who walked the little dog every morning said, "Heard you really showed that old box who's boss," and gave him a hearty thumbs dash up. He was no longer invisible. He was a celebrity in a very small world. It was overwhelming. Mrs. Gable came to see him on the 3rd day. She knocked softly on his door. When he opened it, she didn't come in. She just stood in the hallway, holding a small plate of shortbread cookies. "I come in peace," she said with a gentle smile. "And I come with a proposal, not a demand." She explained what the building's social committee had been planning. They wanted to have a summer social in the community room in 2 weeks. There would be lemonade and potluck dishes. It was something they did every year, and it was usually a bit dull. This year, they wondered if he might be willing to play a few songs. Just a few. For 15 minutes, maybe. Not a concert, just background music. They're not asking for a show, she said, looking him straight in the eye. They're asking to share in the thing you brought back to life. That piano has been a piece of dead furniture for so long. You gave it its voice back. They just want to hear it whisper. That's all. Elias looked at the floor, then at his own hands. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But her words, the thing you brought back to life, touched something else in him. He thought of the piano's golden wires, silent for so long. He had heard its potential. Maybe she was right. The music didn't have to roar. It could just be present. 15 minutes, he said, the words barely audible. However long you like, she replied, her smile deepening. She handed him the plate of cookies and left him standing in his doorway. The next 2 weeks were strange. The fear didn't leave, but it now shared space with a new feeling. Purpose. He began to play his piano again. But now, instead of fragments and private explorations, he found himself thinking of melodies that felt like belonging. A folk song that many might know. A piece of soft blues that felt like a summer evening. Nothing too flashy. Nothing that would feel like he was showing off. He practiced not for perfection, but for comfort. The day of the summer social arrived. The community room was transformed. Someone had strung up fairy lights. The tables were covered with mismatched tablecloths, laden with dishes people had cooked. The old piano sat in its corner, polished to a soft shine. Elias stood at the edge of the room, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. It seemed like the entire building was there. Children were running around. Adults were laughing and talking. It was loud and warm and alive. The retired bus driver, seeing him hover by the door, walked over. He didn't say anything about music. He just said, "My wife made her famous potato salad. You gotta try it before the kids devour it all." He guided Elias to the food table, handing him a plate. For a few minutes, Elias was just a neighbor at a party, not a performer. It helped Dot when the time came. Mrs. Gable didn't make an announcement. She just walked to the piano, gently shooed a little girl away from the keys, and nodded to Elias. The room slowly quieted. All eyes turned to him. The cold knock returned. He walked to the bench, his legs feeling like wood. He sat down. He saw the sea of faces, friendly and expectant. He saw the boy from the fire escape sitting cross-legged right in front of him. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play the dazzling improvised masterpiece from before. He played the gentle folk song. He played it simply, clearly, letting the sweet melody speak for itself. And as he played, something settled. The room was listening, but they were also living. A baby babbled along softly. Someone clinked a spoon against a glass. It was okay. He wasn't in a concert hall. He was in his community room, playing for his neighbors. He moved into the soft blues piece. His shoulders relaxed. He looked up, not at the wall, but at the people. He saw the boy smiling. He saw the accountant nodding his head gently to the rhythm. He saw Mrs. Gable, her eyes closed, just listening. He played for them, not for the void. He played the piano he had fixed. When he finished the third short piece, a warm, steady applause filled the room. It was not the stunned, explosive applause from before. It was different. It was grateful. It was familiar. It was the sound of people saying thank you for a gift they now understood was precious. He didn't play an encore. He just gave a small, genuine smile, a real one that reached his eyes and stood up. And instead of escaping, he did something new. He walked over to the lemonade table and poured himself a cup. People came up to him, not to gush, but to talk. "That first song," said the woman from the third floor. "My grandmother used to sing that." "Thank you," the boy said. "I liked the jazzy one best." The retired bus driver just refilled his lemonade and said, "Good job, son." Elias stayed until the end of the party. He helped stack chairs. He talked about the weather, about the building's plumbing, about the best place to buy good bread. He was still quiet, but he was present. He was part of the hum. Later that night, back in his apartment, the quiet returned. But it had changed again. It wasn't the empty quiet from before the discovery, or the humming quiet of shock. This was a peaceful quiet, a quiet that felt earned. He sat at his own piano and played a few notes, just for himself. It was the same sound as always, but it felt lighter. He was still the piano tuner. He still loved the solitary, precise work of bringing an instrument into harmony. But he was also something else now. He wasn't a hidden genius. He was the man in 1B who could make the old piano sing. The music was no longer a secret he kept from the world. It had become a bridge. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't just living beside his neighbors. He was finally living with them.